It was a dazzling morning in Sonoma Valley, the kind of day where sunlight played across the sprawling vineyards and golden hills, painting a portrait of idyllic beauty. Yet for Richard Donovan, the 42-year-old CEO of Donovan Financial Advisory, the most acclaimed consulting firm on the West Coast, the day's brilliance was little more than an unnoticed backdrop to his meticulously planned routine. Richard stood in his expansive neoclassical estate, a testament to his success and unyielding standards. As he buttoned the custom gold cufflinks on his crisp, white shirt and adjusted the lapels of his tailored navy suit, his reflection stared back at him from a full-length mirror. It was the image of a man whose appearance was as sharp as his mind, impeccable, methodical, and disciplined. "Charles," he called out firmly to his longtime butler, "have the Rolls-Royce Phantom brought around. I'll leave in 10. Charles, a reserved gentleman who had loyally served the Donovan family for decades, inclined his head respectfully before disappearing to fulfill the order. As the echo of Richard's Italian leather shoes descended the marble staircase, his focus sharpened on the day's tight schedule, a prelude to what was arguably the year's most critical meeting in 2 weeks. The sleek black Rolls awaited at the mansion's entrance. Sliding into the plush leather seat, Richard started the car, his mind already racing ahead to the strategies and deals he needed to finalize. The scenic drive to his company's headquarters, a glass skyscraper towering above San Francisco, was a route he could traverse blindfolded. But today, as the car radio crackled to life, something unexpected happened. A deep, resonant voice filled the vehicle, delivering a profound message. Life is but a fleeting moment on the line of eternity. We hold the power to shape it into something meaningful, a masterpiece, or let it pass unnoticed. Every grain of sand in the hourglass reminds us of life's brevity, urging us to live with passion, purpose, and urgency. The words pierced through Richard's usual mental barricade, leaving a rare crack in his stoic demeanor. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, disturbed by the sudden swell of emotions. It was unlike him to be affected by philosophical musings, yet the message struck a chord, resonating with something dormant within. Arriving at the Donovan Financial Advisory Building, Richard dismissed the thoughts, refocusing on the controlled world he had built. His empire was more than a company. It was a symbol of power, discipline, and excellence. From the glistening marble floors of the lobby to the panoramic views from his private penthouse office, every detail was a reflection of his unyielding standards. As he entered the building, employees straightened their postures and averted their eyes. His reputation as a strict perfectionist preceded him. The elevator carried him directly to the top floor, where the scent of his exclusive cologne lingered like a silent announcement of his arrival. When the elevator doors opened, Richard stepped into his spacious office, his gaze immediately drawn to an unfamiliar figure. A young woman stood nervously by his desk, struggling to stack a pile of documents in the pristine inbox tray. Her modest pencil skirt and blouse clashed starkly with the luxurious surroundings. "Good morning, Mr. Donovan," she greeted hesitantly, her voice trembling. Richard halted, his expression one of irritation. "Who are you?" "I'm Emily Cruz, your new assistant," she replied, her voice faltering. "Today is my first day." Before Richard could respond, Emily fumbled to lift a heavy binder from his desk, accidentally sending papers cascading to the floor. His piercing glare darkened. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. Emily dropped to her knees, frantically gathering the scattered papers. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Donovan. I didn't mean—" Richard silenced her with a withering look. "Listen carefully," he said coldly, leaning down slightly. "In my company there's no room for mistakes. Make another one, Emily." He spat her name like a sentence. "And you won't last the week." The tension in the room was palpable as Emily nodded, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She continued to collect the papers, her hands trembling. As the day progressed, Emily immersed herself in her work, determined to prove herself despite the rough start. Every so often, Richard's harsh reprimands echoed in her mind, but she clung to an inner mantra. Life is full of locked doors waiting for the right key. I just need to find mine. Little did she know that the key she sought was closer than she imagined, and it would unlock far more than just professional success. The remainder of Emily's day unfolded in tense silence. She worked diligently, meticulously organizing files, double-checking reports, and familiarizing herself with the demanding rhythm of the office. Despite her best efforts, she felt the weight of every passing glance from the staff. They all seemed to silently acknowledge the unspoken truth. Surviving as Richard Donovan's assistant was no small feat. Meanwhile, Richard busied himself with back-to-back meetings, his demeanor as controlled and precise as ever. He dismissed Emily's earlier blunder from his mind, considering it a minor hiccup in the grand scheme of his meticulously orchestrated empire. As Emily prepared to leave for the day, the private elevator opened abruptly. A tall, elegant woman stepped out. Her blonde waves cascaded down her back, and her high heels clicked purposefully against the marble floor. Dressed in a tailored designer suit, she exuded confidence and authority. "Ah, you must be the new assistant," the woman said, her tone cool and assessing. "I'm Victoria Hale, Chief Marketing Officer, and Richard's fiancée." Emily froze, clutching the stack of documents she had been organizing. She offered a polite smile. "Yes, I'm Emily Cruz. It's a pleasure to meet you." Ms. Hale Victoria's gaze swept over Emily with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "I see you're enthusiastic. That's refreshing. But let me give you some advice," she said, crossing her arms. "This isn't the kind of job where enthusiasm matters. Richard expects perfection, nothing less. Do you think you can manage that?" "I'll do my best," Emily replied softly, her voice tinged with nerves. Victoria raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your best? Well, I suppose we'll see how long that lasts. Good luck. You'll need it." Without waiting for a response, Victoria swept into Richard's office, leaving Emily standing alone in the hallway, her confidence further shaken. Inside the office, Victoria greeted Richard with a kiss on the cheek. "Darling, I see the new assistant has arrived," she said, her tone light, but edged with something sharper. Richard glanced up briefly. "Yes, she's inexperienced but seems competent enough. As long as she doesn't cause more problems, I won't have an issue." Victoria's smile tightened. "I'm sure she'll do her best to impress you. Just be careful, Richard. Sometimes people aren't who they seem." Richard frowned slightly, sensing an undertone in Victoria's words, but choosing to ignore it. His mind was already shifting to the looming annual meeting, which would bring together key investors and partners in just a matter of days. The next morning, Emily arrived early, determined to avoid any missteps. As she reviewed her notes from the previous day, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. To her surprise, Victoria appeared again, her presence as commanding as ever. "Emily," Victoria called out, her voice dripping with mock sweetness, "I need you to update the financial presentation for the annual meeting. Richard wants these new figures included." She handed over a thick folder filled with data. Emily hesitated, her eyes scanning the pages. "Of course, Ms. Hale," she said, though something about the numbers seemed off. "Good. Make sure it's flawless," Victoria said, her tone sharp as she turned and strode away. Emily dove into the task, meticulously entering the data into the presentation. Despite her growing unease about the inconsistencies, she chose not to question Victoria's instructions. By the time Richard arrived and the morning briefing began, the updated presentation was ready. As the briefing commenced, Richard moved through the slides with his usual commanding presence. But when he reached the projections, his confident demeanor faltered. "What is this?" Richard snapped, his sharp tone cutting through the room. "These numbers are completely incorrect." Emily's heart sank. She watched in horror as murmurs spread among the gathered executives. Her pulse quickened as she realized the source of the error, the data Victoria had given her. I don't know how this happened," Emily stammered. "I used the figures provided to me." "Enough," Richard interrupted, his voice cold. "Fix this now." Emily nodded, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She hurried to retrieve the original reports she had saved as a backup, silently berating herself for not trusting her instincts. As she worked to correct the presentation, Victoria observed from the corner of the room, her expression unreadable. With seconds to spare, Emily restored the correct data and updated the presentation. As Richard resumed his briefing, he cast her a brief, scrutinizing glance, but said nothing more. After the meeting, Richard called Emily into his office. She braced herself for another harsh reprimand. "Explain," he said, his tone measured but firm. Emily swallowed hard. "The incorrect data came from a file Ms. Hale gave me. I should have verified it before including it in the presentation. It won't happen again, sir." Richard's brow furrowed, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, to her surprise, his tone softened. "You handled the correction well. I'll let this slide for now, but to be more vigilant next time." "Yes, Mr. Donovan." "Thank you," Emily replied, relief washing over her. As she left the office, a small smile crept onto her lips. Despite the chaos, she had managed to salvage the situation and perhaps earn a sliver of Richard's trust. Days passed, and Emily settled into her demanding role, though the tension in the air remained. Victoria's frequent visits and veiled comments became a source of unease. Despite this, Emily found herself growing more confident in her work, often catching Richard's rare nods of approval. One morning, as Emily reviewed her tasks for the day, she noticed a peculiar detail in the company's internal systems. A document flagged as restricted access had been modified recently. Though her role didn't grant her full clearance, the unusual activity piqued her curiosity. Before she could delve further, the private elevator chimed. Richard emerged, exuding his usual aura of precision and authority. "Emily, in my office, now," he said curtly. Emily followed, clutching her notepad. Inside, Richard motioned for her to sit, an unusual gesture that put her slightly on edge. "I've reviewed your work over the past week," Richard began, leaning back in his chair. "Despite your initial misstep, you've shown potential. But potential isn't enough in this company. You need to be flawless. Understood?" "Yes, Mr. Donovan," Emily replied, her tone steady despite the knot in her stomach. "Good. I'm assigning you a more critical role in the upcoming annual meeting. You'll oversee the logistical coordination and ensure every detail is impeccable. This meeting is non-negotiable in terms of success. If you fail, there won't be a second chance." The weight of his words pressed down on Emily, but she nodded resolutely. "I won't let you down." As she left the office, her determination hardened. She would prove her worth, not just to Richard, but to herself. Meanwhile, Victoria's irritation with Emily had grown into a simmering resentment. Every interaction she observed between Emily and Richard fueled her jealousy, though she hid it well behind her polished facade. One evening, as Richard worked late, Victoria entered his office unannounced. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her perfectly manicured nails grazing the fabric of his suit. "Richard, darling, you've been so tense lately," she purred. "Perhaps we should plan a getaway after the meeting. Somewhere relaxing, just the two of us." Richard barely looked up from his laptop. "I'll consider it," he said absently, his focus unwavering. Frustrated by his dismissal, Victoria decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. She would remind Richard why she was indispensable, and eliminate the growing threat Emily posed. On the day before the annual meeting, Victoria approached Emily with an unusually pleasant demeanor. "Emily, I have a last-minute request," she said, handing over a flash drive. "This contains some critical updates for tomorrow's presentation. Richard asked me to pass it along." Emily hesitated, remembering the earlier incident. "Are you sure Mr. Donovan wants these included? He didn't mention anything to me." Victoria's smile didn't falter. "Trust me, Emily. You'll save him a lot of trouble by adding these now." Reluctantly, Emily accepted the drive and returned to her desk. After a moment of deliberation, she decided to cross-check the contents against the original data. Her instincts told her to proceed cautiously. As she opened the files, her heart sank. The figures were riddled with discrepancies, and the graphs painted a drastically inaccurate picture of the company's financial health. Emily realized it was a deliberate attempt to sabotage the presentation, and she was meant to take the blame. Summoning her courage, Emily marched into Richard's office. "Mr. Donovan, I need to speak with you," she said firmly, holding up the flash drive. Richard looked up, surprised by her tone. "Go on." "These files contain inaccurate data. They were given to me by Ms. Hale, supposedly on your instruction, but I verified the numbers, and they don't align with our reports. I believe there's been a mistake, or worse, intentional tampering." Richard's eyes narrowed as he examined the drive. "Victoria gave this to you?" "Yes," Emily confirmed. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. After a tense pause, he said, "Leave it with me. I'll handle this." Emily nodded and left, her pulse racing. The following day, as the annual meeting commenced, Emily sat nervously in the back of the room. Richard began his presentation with his usual poise, and for a moment everything seemed to be proceeding smoothly. But midway through he paused. "Before we continue," Richard announced, "I'd like to address an internal matter. Yesterday, an attempt was made to compromise the integrity of this presentation. Thanks to the diligence of my assistant, Emily Cruz, the issue was identified and rectified." Murmurs rippled through the room as Richard's gaze swept over the audience. Victoria, seated near the front, stiffened visibly. Richard continued, "Integrity is the foundation of this company. Any breach of that principle will not be tolerated. Moving forward, there will be changes to ensure this standard is upheld." Though he didn't name Victoria directly, the message was clear. After the meeting concluded, Richard approached Emily. "You did well," he said simply, but his tone carried an unspoken acknowledgment. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," Emily replied, relief and pride mixing in her chest. As Richard turned to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought, "Call me Richard." In the days following the annual meeting, the atmosphere in Donovan Financial Advisory shifted. The tension that had long simmered beneath the surface now threatened to boil over. Victoria's reputation took a significant blow, though Richard's subtle handling of the situation prevented a full-blown scandal. Behind closed doors, Richard confronted Victoria. "You put this company at risk," he said, his tone cold and deliberate. "You involved Emily, hoping to pin the blame on her. Why?" Victoria attempted to maintain her composure. "I was trying to help. I thought those figures were necessary." "Don't insult my intelligence," Richard interrupted sharply. "This wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate." Victoria's silence spoke volumes. "This is the last time you'll interfere in my business or my life," he said firmly. "Pack your things. We're done." Victoria's carefully constructed facade cracked, and for a moment her anger flared. But faced with Richard's unyielding resolve, she realized there was no way to salvage the situation. With Victoria gone, the dynamics at Donovan Financial Advisory began to shift. Emily, though still navigating the challenges of her demanding role, felt a newfound sense of respect among her colleagues. One afternoon, Richard called Emily into his office. Unlike previous meetings, his tone was uncharacteristically warm. "You've proven yourself, Emily," he said, leaning back in his chair, "not just as an assistant, but as someone I can trust. I'd like you to take on a more significant role in the company." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Richard, I won't let you down." "I know you won't," he replied with a rare smile. That evening, as Emily prepared to leave, she received an unexpected invitation from Richard. "I'm hosting a small dinner at my home this weekend," he said casually. "A few key clients will be there. I'd like you to join us." Emily hesitated, unsure if this was part of her professional responsibilities or something more. "I'd be honored," she finally said. On the night of the dinner, Emily arrived at Richard's estate, her nerves on edge. The grandeur of the mansion was overwhelming, but she carried herself with quiet confidence. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by Richard, who seemed momentarily taken aback by her appearance. Emily's understated elegance was a stark contrast to the opulence around her, yet it commanded attention. Throughout the evening, Emily's poise and intelligence shone. She engaged effortlessly with the clients, impressing even the most skeptical among them. Richard watched from a distance, a growing admiration evident in his expression. After the dinner concluded, as the guests began to depart, Richard approached Emily on the terrace. "You were remarkable tonight," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Thank you," she replied, meeting his gaze. "I'm just grateful for the opportunity." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was charged, filled with unspoken words and unacknowledged emotions. The following weeks brought Richard and Emily closer, their professional partnership evolving into something deeper, yet both hesitated to acknowledge the shift, each grappling with their own uncertainties. One evening, as they worked late on a new project, Emily hummed a melody under her breath. Richard froze, the sound striking a chord deep within him. "What was that?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Emily looked up, startled. "Oh, just a tune I've known for as long as I can remember. It's comforting, somehow." Richard's expression turned pensive. "It's familiar. I think I've heard it before." Emily frowned. "That's unlikely. I've never shared it with anyone." For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the connection between them intensifying. As time went on, Richard began to open up about his past, a tragic love lost too soon, the source of the walls he had built around himself. Emily listened, her empathy and understanding deepening the bond between them. One evening, Richard revealed something extraordinary. "That melody," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was a song my late fiancée used to sing. She said it was a promise to find her way back to me." Emily's breath caught. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Richard asked, his gaze piercing. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that transcended logic, a sense that their connection was more than mere coincidence. Months later, as their lives intertwined further, Richard and Emily found themselves drawn together not just by circumstance, but by something far greater. Their partnership transformed into a love story that defied time and expectations. In a quiet ceremony surrounded by close friends and colleagues, Richard and Emily exchanged vows, their journey coming full circle. The vineyards of Sonoma Valley bore witness to their union. The golden hills bathed in the light of a setting sun. As they danced beneath the stars, the melody that had once been a distant memory now played as a promise fulfilled, a reminder that love, no matter how improbable, always finds its way. Months passed, and the bond between Richard and Emily grew stronger with each shared moment. What began as a professional partnership had evolved into something neither of them could ignore. Their connection was undeniable, effortless yet profound, as though they were two pieces of a puzzle meant to fit together. Richard, a man once defined by his rigid exterior and an unwavering focus on success, found himself softening in ways he hadn't thought possible. Emily's warmth and resilience had pierced through his emotional armor, revealing a version of himself he hadn't seen in years. A man capable of not only commanding respect but also offering tenderness. Emily, for her part, was equally transformed. Richard's belief in her abilities gave her confidence to push beyond the boundaries of her comfort zone. She no longer felt like the timid new assistant struggling to find her place. Instead, she was an integral part of his world, both professionally and personally. And yet, the unspoken question lingered between them. How much of their connection was rooted in the present, and how much was tied to the echoes of a past they were only beginning to unravel. One evening, as the two worked late in the penthouse office, Richard broke the comfortable silence. "Emily," he began, his voice unusually hesitant, "there's something I've been meaning to ask." She looked up from her notes, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" "That song," he said, his tone softening. "The one you hum sometimes. You said you've known it forever?" Emily nodded slowly. "Yes, it's strange. I don't even know where I learned it. It's just always been with me, like a part of me I can't explain." Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "My late fiancée used to hum that same melody. She said it was a promise, a way to find her way back to me no matter what." The air between them grew thick with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. Emily's heart raced as she processed his words, the eerie familiarity of the melody now impossible to dismiss. "It doesn't make sense," Emily murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "How could I?" Richard interrupted gently. "Sometimes sense isn't what we need. Sometimes it's just faith." As their relationship deepened, Richard began to consider what once seemed unthinkable, letting go of his carefully controlled existence and embracing the vulnerability of love. One evening, he invited Emily to his estate under the guise of discussing a new project. The vineyards stretched endlessly under a sky ablaze with the colors of sunset. As they walked among the rows of grapevines, the air heavy with the scent of ripe fruit, Richard reached for her hand. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "meeting you wasn't an accident. I don't know if it was fate, destiny, or something else entirely, but I do know this: you've changed my life. You've reminded me that there's more to living than just building an empire." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing, "I don't want to imagine my life without you in it. Will you marry me?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, her heart swelling with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "Richard, yes, I will." The day of their wedding dawned bright and clear. The vineyards of Sonoma Valley bathed in golden light. The ceremony was intimate, attended only by close friends, family, and a handful of trusted colleagues. Every detail reflected the essence of who they were, elegant yet understated, timeless yet full of warmth. As Emily walked down the aisle, her dress flowing like water around her, Richard's breath caught in his chest. She was radiant, her smile lighting up the already dazzling day. Their vows were simple, but heartfelt, each word carrying the weight of their journey together. When they exchanged rings, it was as though the world around them faded away, leaving only the two of them standing in the glow of their love. That evening, as the reception unfolded under a canopy of twinkling lights, Richard and Emily shared their first dance. The familiar melody played softly, filling the air with a sense of completion. Guests watched in awe as the couple swayed together, their movements perfectly in sync. To Richard, the moment felt surreal, as though he were living a dream he hadn't dared to believe was possible. To Emily, it was a promise fulfilled, a reminder that even the most improbable love stories have a way of finding their conclusion. As the night deepened, Richard pulled Emily close, his voice a low murmur in her ear. "I never thought I'd have this again," he admitted. "Thank you for proving me wrong." Emily smiled, her head resting against his chest. "Love always finds a way," she whispered. In the months and years that followed, Richard and Emily built a life together that was as vibrant and dynamic as the vineyards that surrounded them. Their love story became a beacon of hope for those around them, a testament to the power of resilience, connection, and the belief that some bonds are unbreakable, no matter the odds. As they stood together on their estate one quiet evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Richard took Emily's hand and hummed the familiar melody. She joined him, their voices blending into a harmony that carried on the breeze. a reminder that love, no matter how improbable, always finds its way. In the months following their shared realization, Richard and Emily found their lives gradually intertwining in ways neither had anticipated. Their days at the office, once dominated by formality and clear professional boundaries, became moments of quiet partnership. Late nights poring over financial projections or planning company strategies were no longer purely about work. They became opportunities to connect, to learn more about each other's quirks, dreams, and fears. Emily marveled at how Richard, a man once so guarded and stoic, could let his defenses down, revealing a deeply thoughtful and even vulnerable side. Richard, in turn, found himself captivated by Emily's unrelenting optimism and her ability to find beauty in the simplest moments. She would pause to admire a sunrise spilling over the glass windows of the Donovan Financial Advisory Building, or laugh at a small mistake she'd made, treating life with a grace he had long forgotten. For years, Richard had focused solely on success, on perfecting every detail of his existence. Emily's presence reminded him that life wasn't just a series of accomplishments. It was a mosaic of fleeting, beautiful moments, meant to be cherished. One evening, after an especially long day, Richard invited Emily to join him for dinner at his estate. The invitation caught her off guard, as it was the first time he had opened his private world to her outside of the office. She arrived just as the sun was setting, its golden hues painting the vineyards that surrounded his property. Richard met her at the entrance, a rare smile softening his usually serious demeanor. As they walked through the gardens, he spoke candidly about his late fiancée for the first time, recounting the love they had shared and the pain of her loss. Emily listened intently, her heart aching for the man who had carried so much sorrow for so long. As the evening went on, their conversation drifted to lighter topics, books they loved, places they dreamed of visiting, and the kind of future they envisioned. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to imagine a future that included love again. Weeks turned into months, and their connection only deepened. The melody Emily often hummed continued to weave its way into their lives, a hauntingly familiar refrain that seemed to bridge the past and present. One evening, as they walked through the vineyards under a canopy of stars, Richard stopped abruptly, turning to Emily with an expression she couldn't quite read. Without preamble, he took her hands in his and said, "Emily, meeting you wasn't just a coincidence. I've spent my entire life trying to control everything, but you've taught me that some things, perhaps the most important things, can't be planned. I don't want to spend another day without you by my side. Will you marry me?" Emily's breath caught in her throat. Tears welled in her eyes as she searched his face, seeing not just the powerful businessman, but the kind, vulnerable man she had come to love. She nodded, her voice trembling as she said, "Yes. Of course, yes." Their engagement marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with equal parts joy and uncertainty. Planning a wedding was no small feat, especially for a man accustomed to perfection in all things. Yet Richard surprised Emily by taking a hands-on approach, insisting on personally overseeing details to ensure the day reflected who they were as a couple. Emily, ever practical, often teased him about his meticulous nature, but deep down she appreciated the effort he put into making their day special. The wedding was set to take place at the estate, with the vineyards serving as a breathtaking backdrop. On the morning of the ceremony, Emily woke with a mix of excitement and nerves. Her closest friends surrounded her as she prepared, helping her into a dress that seemed to have been made for her alone. The gown was simple yet elegant, its flowing fabric reminiscent of the vineyard's gentle slopes. Meanwhile, Richard stood in his study, adjusting his tie in the mirror. For once, his usual calm was replaced by a palpable nervousness. Charles, his loyal butler, entered quietly, offering a rare piece of advice. "Sir, I've watched you face boardrooms full of the world's most powerful individuals without flinching. Yet today, you seem human, nervous even. It suits you." Richard chuckled softly, the tension in his shoulders easing as he realized the truth in Charles's words. When Emily walked down the aisle, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sunlight streamed through the leaves, casting a golden glow over the scene. Richard's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment every doubt, fear, and sorrow he had carried dissolved. Their vows were spoken with quiet intensity, each word carrying the weight of their journey. The reception was a celebration unlike any other. Friends, family, and colleagues mingled under strings of fairy lights, the air filled with laughter and music. Richard and Emily's first dance was to the melody that had brought them together, a tune that now held a new meaning. As they swayed under the stars, it was as though the universe itself had conspired to bring them to this moment. In the days and weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Richard and Emily balanced their professional ambitions with the joys of building a home together. The estate, once a symbol of solitude for Richard, became a place of warmth and love. They often spent evenings on the terrace, watching the sunset over the vineyards, their hands entwined as they spoke of dreams yet to be fulfilled. One particularly quiet evening, as they shared a bottle of wine from the estate's own vineyard, Emily turned to Richard and asked, "Do you ever think about how all of this came to be? How two people from such different worlds ended up here?" Richard smiled, his gaze soft. "I think about it every day, and I've stopped trying to make sense of it. Some things aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be lived." Years later, their love story became the foundation of a legacy far beyond their personal lives. Together, they launched initiatives to support young entrepreneurs, creating opportunities for those who, like Emily once had, simply needed someone to believe in them. Their story was told and retold, inspiring countless others to take chances on love, on connection, and on the belief that even the most improbable paths can lead to something extraordinary. On their anniversary, as they danced once again beneath the stars, Emily rested her head against Richard's chest, humming the familiar melody. He held her close, his voice low, as he whispered, "Thank you for finding me." "And thank you," she replied softly, "for letting me in." Their dance continued long into the night, the melody of their love carrying on the breeze, a promise fulfilled, a story still being written. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Leave your name in the comments for a personalized shout-out, and stay tuned for more inspiring tales. Up next, wealthy woman hires a husband for a day.